Hi, everybody. This is Kelly with Two Broads Talking Politics. I'm so excited to bring you this episode, our second episode about Alabama in a row. It's episodes like this that get me really excited about what's possible in November. I talked with 3 different Democratic women who are running for office in Alabama. They all clearly love Alabama, and they all point to the energy that's coming out of Alabama right now. I hope you listen to their stories and support them. Hello, everybody. This is Kelly from the Two Broads Talking Politics podcast, and I am here on the line in this segment with Heather Milam, who is running for Secretary of State in Alabama. Hello, Heather.
Hi, Kelly. Thank you for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on. To start, could you tell us just a little bit about your background and why you've decided to run for Secretary of State?
Yeah, sure, of course. So I was born in Alabama. I'm an Alabamian since birth. I love this state. I'm from this state. I'm educated in this state in the public school system, and I graduated high school for Talladega County school system. I went to Auburn University. My graduate degree is from this state. I care deeply about it. The thing that I think is missing and something that has been people across the country, but certainly in Alabama, we're acutely aware of the integrity of our vote. And a lot of that responsibility, if only figuratively, certainly lies within the Secretary of State's office. And I am not confident that our voting system is working as efficiently as it should be for all Alabamians. And so I was really led to run for this office. I care about voters. I care about Alabamians, and democracy works when we vote. And I'm sad to see the lack of participation in many of these elections, and I want to change that.
Could you give me an example or two of the ways that it's not working currently? We've been hearing stories from all over about voting laws that are problematic, but could you talk about the ways that is happening on the ground in Alabama?
Sure. So one of the things that we saw last year during the special election was confusion with the primaries. In Alabama, and this may sound a little complicated for your listeners, but we had a special election last year where we voted in Doug Jones to the U.S. Senate. There was a primary election, and the Republican Party had a primary runoff. And if you voted in the Democratic primary, you could not vote in the Republican primary runoff. A lot of people were confused because the messaging coming out from the Secretary of State's office was, and I'm paraphrasing, but, we will prosecute people to the fullest extent if you crossover vote, and then crossover voting became this thing that most people didn't understand. And so a lot of people were intimidated to go vote. If you are the Secretary of State or some leader in sort of an arbiter role for our election system, calling the winner of the election before it happens is an intimidating factor. It's an intimidation tactic. So I think those are two things from the leadership role that needs to change. There should be the leader of the Secretary of State's office, the Secretary herself or himself, should be completely removed from intimidating or influencing any elections. Another thing that we're seeing is in the state of Alabama, we are making it more difficult for people to vote. And that one that many people are familiar with is the photo ID law that was passed. At the same time, many DMVs where you would get a photo ID were being closed in some of the poorest counties in the state of Alabama. Now, we can say that's coincidental and that's fine, but I think that was a tactic to disenfranchise more people from voting in Alabama. There was no problem. There is no voter fraud to speak of. Statistically speaking, it is insignificant or almost non-existent at all here in Alabama. So they weren't fixing a problem with that. But as it may be, the law passed, and I think the Secretary of State and the Secretary of State's office should work tirelessly to enfranchise those voters. So those are some ways that we're seeing the disenfranchisement and the intimidation of voters. And one other thing I would like to say is that last year, the 1901 Constitution that governs Alabama is the largest constitution in the world. One of the arbitrary terms in that Constitution was something that they called moral turpitude. And that was translated by judges across counties, across the state. There was no identifiable terms of crimes that constitute moral turpitude. And so last year, the governor, Kay Ivey, signed into law the definition of what moral turpitude is. The SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, estimates that somewhere around 250,000 Alabamians immediately gain their right to vote again. And we're not enfranchising those individuals either. So there's a lot of room for improvement. And so those are some really good examples, I think, of things that are currently not working for Alabamians.
Has there been any talk in Alabama about adding things like automatic voter registration, these so-called motor voter laws?
I think that there's been a lot of talk along the Democratic side, along Democrats. I'm pushing for it. I am. When I talk to legislators or people campaigning to be our next state legislators, I am talking to them about automatic voter registration for 18-year-olds if they have signed up and qualified for a driver's license. Another thing that I like across other states, such as Colorado and Oregon, is that they mail out absentee ballots to all registered voters. One thing I learned while volunteering for campaigns, but most specifically with the Doug Jones campaign, when working hotlines for people calling in to try and find where their polling station is or getting a ride to the poll, I shielded hundreds of phone calls of people across Alabama who physically could not get to their polling station. And I was just one volunteer on that campaign, and I can't imagine how many people across the state of Alabama are really struggle just to get to their polling station. So I think automatic voter registration when you turn 18 and also mailing out absentee ballots to every eligible voter in the state of Alabama would be two enormous improvements in voter participation here in the state.
I live in Illinois, and one of the things that we've been dealing with through Indivisible Chicago is the cross-check program. So for listeners who don't know what this is, cross-check is a number of states sharing voter records to try to make sure that people are not registered in more than one state. In theory, this is a sound idea. In practice, the ways that cross-check is working are very much that it's not working. It's very problematic in terms of all sorts of different things, integrity of data, and lots of ways that it's being used to disenfranchise voters instead of really make sure that data is accurate. So I believe that Alabama is still registered in the cross-check program.
We are registered in the cross-check program. We're also registered with ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center. I think you were spot on with cross-check. To add to that, the system is administered by the Office of the Secretary of State of Kansas. And for those who may not know who that is Chris Kobach. He was the vice chair of the now defunct Presidential Advisory Commission of Election Integrity for the current president. That is obviously no longer a thing. So I think out of the gate, knowing that it is something organized and housed, in fact, by the Secretary of State's office there in Kansas, by Chris Kobach, should send up a red flag immediately. There are journalistic entities, Rolling Stone, Ars Technica, ProPublica, who continue to find enormous holes in the system and why it's not holding up. There are a lot of false positives when they're cross-checking names, when fathers are counted as sons because the junior and the senior don't show up in the filing system. And that can just be a simple human error where a name is listed on the wrong line when you're at the polling station. Researchers at Stanford, UPenn, Harvard, Yale, even Microsoft published a paper that said it makes it 99% more likely that a legitimate voter gets purged from rolls than an illegitimate one with cross-check. We're seeing that there are a lot of security concerns, a lot of data breach possibilities. One of the things that Crosscheck uses is an FTP site that's managed by the Secretary of State's office in Arkansas. And the problem with FTPs is that they're more vulnerable than more secure sites called SFTP, which if you ask me to tell you what those words are for that acronym, I'm not sure I could tell you, but I understand that FTPs are far less secure than an SFTP. Someone said in an article that I read that an FTP site is like a postcard, but an SFTP site is like a letter sealed in an envelope locked in a vault. So Crosscheck doesn't seem to be doing what it's trying to do, and that is, making sure that people who pass away are purged from the voter rolls. And let's be real, let's be clear. We are a very mobile society. We are moving from state to state. And in 2 years' time after graduating college, I had 3 different mailing addresses. So I understand that we want the rolls to be valid and up to date. But it seems to me in the state of Alabama that ERIC, the Electronic Registration Information Center, which we are using and currently pay for, is a far better, far more efficient, far safer, and a bipartisan effort, in fact, maintaining up-to-date voting roles. And so I fail to see how Crosscheck is doing the job that it's supposed to be doing, especially with states like Alabama that already has ERIC in place.
Would this be something that the Secretary of State could decide to pull out of Crosscheck, or is that something that the legislature would have to decide?
It depends. With ERIC, it does require legislation, and Crosscheck very well may require the same. I am still doing more research on that because there is a little bit of vagueness, especially with constituents here in the state of Alabama, on where the line is drawn with what the Secretary of State's office has the authority to do and what legislators there in Montgomery have to tell that person or that office to do. But with ERIC, you are required to have legislation and to also pay for it, although it's not that expensive for the budget.
So we've talked a lot about voting. What are some other things that the Secretary of State's office does in Alabama?
That's the number one question I get. What does the Secretary of State do?
In Illinois, the Secretary of State is actually not in charge of voting. So I'm always sort of curious what it is that they do.
Well, and it's different in every state. So here in the state of Alabama, the Secretary of State's office, this is how I explain it to people. The Secretary of State's office manages all the files for the state. We are a really, really large filing cabinet for the state. So legislative, executive papers and digital papers, bills and documents, that all runs through the office. Also, when you apply for a business license, that comes through our office as well. If you are running for a public office and you need to file your committee and campaign, you file that with the state, the Secretary of State's office. We maintain and make sure elections are run smoothly and fairly. We also, and what most people understand the Secretary of State to do is, yes, we do manage all of the results of our election system. And so that is what most people understand the current Secretary of State to do. But beyond that, it's just a really large filing cabinet for the state of Alabama. And it's some fun stuff. Secretary of State is the official notary for the state of Alabama when the governor signs stuff. I get to supply that great seal of Alabama and notarize that document when the governor signs it.
So the current Secretary of State in Alabama is a Republican, and he is in office since 2015. So he's in his first term now.
Yes.
He seems to be a rather loud individual on Twitter.
Well, he actually blocks me and many, many people that I know. So from my personal account, I don't see his personal account any longer, which I find really interesting, but he is loud. Yes.
So what do you think the chances are that this seat then can flip from Republican to Democrat in this election?
Well, I think what we've seen is two things. One, based on the Doug Jones campaign last year, if we can get out the vote, and that is what we did with the Doug Jones campaign, a Democrat can win this election. The numbers indicate that if we get the right people to the polls, get people voting, the more people who vote, the better chance a Democrat has to win this office. Second to that, you look at the numbers 4 years ago, a Democrat put her name on the ballot. She ran unopposed to the primary. I don't gather that there was a strong effort. There wasn't a lot of money in that campaign to campaign across the state of Alabama, and yet she came back with 36% of the vote. And I think that too is a strong indicator that those two things together seem to indicate that there is a strong possibility, working with qualified individuals across the state who can help me canvass and phone bank and help people get to the polls. We can put a Democrat in that office, and I'm really excited about it. And I wouldn't be running if I didn't think that I could win. And so I think we're forcing a narrative. We're encouraging people to vote. That's a big part of my platform. It's just simply, are you registered to vote? No, let's get you registered to vote. Ask all of your friends and family to register to vote, and let's all get to the polls June 5th in the primary and again November 6th in the general, because I think that first off, it matters. It's so important that we all vote, but that is what's going to, shift the political structure here in Alabama. It's just people showing up to vote. And Doug Jones's election gave a lot of people hope that we can actually make a difference. And I think we're going to champion those who worked hard and got out and vote. And we're going to encourage more people to do that this year in the midterms.
That's great. And so the last question then that I had for you was about your experience with Emerge Alabama. Seems like there are a lot of women running for office this year in Alabama, which is fantastic. So can you tell me a little bit about what Emerge is and what you did in that program?
Emerge Alabama is a grassroots effort that started in California in the early 2000s They are training Democratic women to run for office. A very popular graduate is Kamala Harris out of California. After the 2016 presidential election, there was an enormous influx of interest in Emerge Alabama and other grassroots organizations like Emily's List. Women had had enough. We came out of that election with the largest march in